The winter of 1883 didn't just freeze the rivers of the Dakota Territory, it froze men's souls. When a greedy family stripped a young woman of her inheritance and threw her into a deadly blizzard, they expected the ice to bury her forever. They never accounted for the ghost of the mountain. Historical records from the Dakota Territory in the late 19th century often speak of the Great White Hurricane, a winter so vicious that cattle froze standing up, and entire settlements were swallowed by snowdrifts. But the bitterest cold that year didn't come from the sky. It came from the human heart. Cora Pendleton was 22 years old when she lost everything. Her father, Thomas Pendleton, a respected prospector and landowner in the bustling, unforgiving mining town of Deadwood's Reach, had passed away suddenly from a lung fever just 3 days prior. Before the dirt was even settled on his grave, the wolves began to circle. The chief among them was her older half-brother, Amos Pendleton. Amos was a man whose greed was only matched by his cruelty. With the ink barely dry on a forged will, sanctioned by the deeply corrupt town magistrate, Judge Arthur P. Harrison, and enforced by Sheriff Horace Miller, Amos staked his claim. It was dusk on December 14th when Amos kicked the heavy oak door of the Pendleton homestead open, bringing the biting wind inside. Cora was sitting by the hearth, clutching her father's brass pocket watch, her eyes still red from mourning. "Pack what you can carry in a flour sack, Cora." Amos snarled his boots, tracking mud and ice onto the braided rug. "This house is mine now. The land, the livestock, the mine. Judge Harrison signed the decree this morning." Cora stood up, her voice trembling but defiant. "That's a lie, Amos. Papa promised me the homestead. He told you he was leaving you the southern pastures. You can't just throw me out." Sheriff Miller stepped out from the shadows of the porch, resting a hand on the pearl handle of his Colt revolver. "The law says otherwise, Miss Pendleton. I suggest you listen to your brother. The stagecoach to Cheyenne doesn't run till spring. You'd best start walking to the boarding house in town." "I have no money for a boarding house," Cora cried, the reality of her nightmare setting in. "Amos, please, there is a blizzard coming over the ridge. You can't send me out tonight." Amos grabbed her by the arm, his grip bruising her skin, and dragged her toward the threshold. "You aren't family. You're the daughter of my father's second mistake. Get off my property." He didn't even allow her to fetch her heavy wool winter coat. With nothing but a thin woolen shawl, a calico dress, and a pair of worn leather boots, Cora was physically shoved off the porch into the howling, freezing dark. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, the deadbolt sliding into place with a sickening finality. Cora was entirely alone in the Dakota wild. The town of Deadwood's Reach was 5 miles down the valley. Under normal conditions, it was a rigorous but manageable walk. That night, however, the temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, and the sky unleashed a torrential fury of white. The wind screamed through the ponderosa pines like a wounded animal whipping snow into her face with the force of shattered glass. Within the first mile, her lips turned blue. By the second mile, the path disappeared entirely beneath 3 feet of fresh, drifting snow. Cora stumbled her boots, sinking deep, her muscles burning as she fought the relentless resistance of the elements. Panic set in as the sun completely vanished, leaving her in an ocean of blinding, terrifying darkness. She clutched her thin shawl tight against her chest, her fingers numb and unresponsive. Every breath she took felt like inhaling razor blades. "Keep walking," she told herself. "If you stop, you die." But nature has a cruel way of extinguishing human willpower. By the 3rd mile, the shivering stopped, a dangerous biological sign that hypothermia was reaching its final fatal stage. Her mind began to play tricks on her. She saw warm lanterns glowing in the trees where there were none. She heard her father's voice, calling her name from the shadows. A hidden root caught the toe of her boot, and Cora pitched forward into a snowbank. She tried to push herself up, but her arms felt like lead. The snow, which had felt so biting and cruel just an hour ago, suddenly began to feel warm. A deceptive, cozy lethargy washed over her. It would be so easy to just close her eyes. Just for a minute. As her vision faded to a fuzzy black, she thought she heard the heavy crunch of boots in the snow. Not the frantic scuffling of a town sheriff, but the slow, deliberate tread of a giant. Through her half-closed eyelids, a massive silhouette blocked out the falling snow. A man clad in thick, bare fur and elk hide knelt beside her. He reached out with a gloved hand, brushing the ice from her frozen cheek. Cora tried to scream, fearing Amos had come to finish the job, but only a dry rattle escaped her throat. The man effortlessly scooped her up into his massive arms, cradling her against his broad, heat-radiating chest. He pulled the thick collar of his wolfskin coat over her face to shield her from the wind. As the darkness finally claimed her, a deep, gravelly voice rumbled against her ear, softer than the falling snow. "I've got you. You are safe now." When Cora finally drifted back to consciousness, she didn't feel the biting wind. She felt an overwhelming, radiating heat, the sharp scent of burning pine needles and strong, chicory coffee filled her lungs. She opened her eyes, blinking against the amber glow of a roaring hearth fire. She was no longer in the snow. She was lying on a sturdy cot buried under a small mountain of thick, luxurious pelt blankets, buffalo wolf, and bear. She was wearing an oversized flannel shirt that smelled of wood smoke and leather, her frozen dress having been removed to save her life. Panic spiked in her chest. She shot up, pulling the pelts tightly around her neck, her eyes darting around the room. It was a small, meticulously organized log cabin. Dried herbs and smoked meats hung from the ceiling rafters. A polished Winchester rifle rested above the doorframe, and sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of cedar with a hunting knife, was the largest man she had ever seen. He was easily 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, and his hair, long and unruly, fell past his ears. A jagged, faded scar ran from his left temple down to his jawline, a brutal souvenir from a past life. Yet when he looked up at her, his eyes were startlingly clear. They were a pale, piercing grey, holding a profound, unexpected gentleness. "You shouldn't move," he said. His voice was a deep baritone, quiet but commanding. "Your core temperature is still low. The frostbite on your toes and fingers was close, but you'll keep 'em." "Who are you?" Cora managed to croak out her throat, dry and raspy. "Where am I?" The man set his knife and wood down, rising slowly to avoid startling her. He walked over to a cast-iron stove, poured a tin cup of hot coffee, and brought it to the cot. He didn't hand it to her immediately. He held it out, waiting for her to reach for it, giving her control. "Name's Wade. Wade Callahan," he said. "You're high up in the Black Hills, about 12 miles north of Deadwood's Reach. Found you in the timberline. Another 20 minutes out there, and the spring thaw would have been the only thing to find you." Cora took the cup with trembling hands, the heat of the tin seeping wonderfully into her palms. She took a slow sip. "Thank you," she whispered. "My name is Cora. Cora Pendleton." Wade retreated to his chair by the fire, giving her space. For a long time, the only sound was the crackling of the logs. Wade Callahan was a ghost to the people of the Dakota Territory. A former army tracker and frontiersman, he had walked away from civilization after the brutal frontier wars of the 1870s, sickened by the greed and violence of men. He lived entirely off the land, descending into towns only once a year, to trade furs for coffee and salt. He didn't care for the affairs of the valley. But when he had seen a girl left to die in the ice, the code of the mountains demanded he intervene. "I know of the Pendletons," Wade finally said, his grey eyes studying her. "Thomas Pendleton passed a few days back. Word travels even up here." Tears pricked Cora's eyes, the memory of her father and her brother's betrayal hitting her all over again. "My brother Amos. He threw me out. He bribed the judge and the sheriff to take the homestead. He pushed me into the storm." Wade's expression darkened, the muscles in his jaw ticking. But what he said next sent a chill down Cora's spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. "He didn't just throw you out, Cora," Wade rumbled. He reached down beside his chair and picked up a heavy, snow-crusted saddlebag that didn't belong to him. "When I found you, I went back at first light to obscure our tracks. I found 2 sets of boot prints following yours, from the edge of town right up to the timberline." Cora's breath hitched. "Following me. They weren't trying to catch you," Wade explained grimly. "They were keeping their distance, pacing you. They were watching you freeze, waiting for you to drop dead so they could be sure. When the storm got too thick, they turned back, figuring the mountain would finish the job." Cora felt physically sick. Amos hadn't just been cruel. He had orchestrated an execution. But why? The homestead was valuable, yes. But Amos already had the forged papers. With the law in his pocket, he didn't need to kill her to take the house. Unless... Cora frantically patted the side of the cot until she found her discarded wet dress hanging over a chair to dry. She reached into the hidden inner pocket and pulled out her father's brass pocket watch. It was heavy, engraved with an intricate eagle. "What is that?" Wade asked, stepping closer. "My father." Cora whispered, her hands shaking as she pried the back casing of the watch open with her thumbnail. "On his deathbed, he told me that Amos was a fool, that Amos only saw the dirt, but my father owned the mountain." She removed the brass backing. Tucked tightly inside the gears was a micro-folded piece of oilcloth. She spread it out on the blanket. It was a crude map stamped with an official, undeniable seal from the Federal Land Office in Washington. Wade leaned over his massive frame, casting a shadow over the cot. He read the coordinates. The Silver Queen vein. He breathed genuine shock in his voice. "Rumors say that vein dried up 10 years ago." "It didn't dry up," Cora said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate fire. "Papa bought the surrounding acreage under a dummy corporation. He found the motherlode. He put the deed in my name, exclusively my name, the day before he died. Amos must have found out about the secondary will. But he couldn't find the deed." Wade looked at the fragile woman sitting on his cot. He saw the trauma in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw a spine of absolute steel. "As long as you're alive," Wade said, slowly piecing it together, "Amos can never legally claim the gold. If you show up in Cheyenne with that federal deed, his forged will is worthless. You're the richest woman in the Dakota Territory. And a dead woman if I ever step foot in Deadwood's Reach again," Cora replied, looking down at the map. "He has the sheriff. He has the town. I have no one." Wade stared at her for a long moment. He had spent 10 years running from the world, avoiding the exact kind of bloodshed and corruption that was currently unfolding in the valley below. He was a man of peace now. But as he looked at Cora, Pendleton bruised, betrayed yet fiercely clutching the legacy her father left her. Something ancient and protective stirred within his chest. He walked over to the door, took the Winchester rifle down from its rack, and checked the chamber. The metallic clack-clack echoed loudly in the quiet cabin. "You're wrong about that, Cora," Wade whispered, his grey eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying, beautiful intensity. "You have me. For 3 long weeks, The blizzard raged outside the cabin, locking the Dakota Territory in an impenetrable vault of white. Inside, however, a profound and quiet transformation was taking place. Cora Pendleton, who had been raised in the stifling, polite parlors of a wealthy mining family, learned the brutal, beautiful rhythms of mountain survival. Wade Callahan was a man of few words, but his actions spoke of a deep, unyielding honor. He brewed bitter willow bark tea to soothe the lingering ache of her frost-bitten toes, and he surrendered his own heavy buffalo hide bed, insisting on sleeping on a simple pallet by the hearth. As Cora's strength returned, the silence between them shifted from tense apprehension to a comfortable electric intimacy. She watched him clean his Winchester rifle, his massive, calloused hands moving with surprising grace. In return, she told him stories of her father, of the sprawling maps he used to draw, and of the greed that had slowly poisoned her half-brother, Amos. Wade listened, his piercing grey eyes never leaving her face. For a man who had spent 10 years trying to forget the world, he found himself hanging on her every word. "You didn't just come to these mountains to hunt, did you?" "Wade," Cora asked one evening, watching the firelight dance across the jagged scar on his jaw. Wade paused, his whittling his shoulders tensing slightly under his flannel shirt. "Before I came up here, I wore a tin star. I rode with U.S. Marshal Heck Thomas down in the Indian Territory. We hunted the worst kind of men who killed for a few ounces of gold or a patch of dirt. I saw so much blood spilled over greed that I stopped seeing the humanity in anyone. So I walked away, left my badge on Heck's desk, and rode north until the trails ran out." He looked at her, his expression softening into something incredibly vulnerable. "I thought there was nothing left down in the valley worth saving, until I found you in the snow." Cora's breath hitched. She reached out her small, pale fingers, gently tracing the rough knuckles of his hand, resting on the table. Wade didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers. The warmth of his grip sent a sudden, thrilling jolt straight to her heart. "We can't hide up here forever," Cora whispered, the reality of their situation pressing in. "Amos knows I'm out here. If he doesn't find a body when the spring thaw comes, he will send men." "He already has," Wade replied, his voice hardening into steel. That morning, while checking his snare lines along the lower ridge, Wade had spotted the smoke of a campfire. It wasn't the small, hidden fire of a drifter. It was a large, arrogant blaze. Through his brass spyglass, he had identified Sheriff Horace Miller and a man Wade recognized from his lawman days, Texas. Jack Vermillion, a ruthless, heavily armed tracker who sold his gun to the highest bidder. Amos wasn't taking any chances. "Amos is getting desperate," Wade explained, pulling a worn leather map from his saddlebag and spreading it over the wooden table. "He must be trying to sell the Silver Queen vein to one of the eastern syndicates. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company has been buying up everything in the territory. But to finalize a sale of that magnitude, the lawyers will dig into the county records. Amos needs to prove you died of natural causes in the storm, so his forged will holds up. Then we have to get to Cheyenne," Cora said, her eyes tracing the topographical lines on the map. "I have the federal deed. If we reach the district judge, Amos loses everything. The passes are snowed in and Miller's men are watching the valley roads," Wade said, tapping a thick finger on a jagged peak marked on the paper. "But there is an old logging telegraph relay station up on the Devil's Horn Ridge. It's run by an old hermit, a friend of mine. If we can make it there, I can wire Marshal Heck Thomas. He owes me his life. If I tell him the local sheriff is complicit in murder, he'll bring federal deputies on the Union Pacific train before Amos can blink." It was a desperate, dangerous plan, It required them to leave the safety of the cabin and traverse the most treacherous part of the mountain in the dead of winter, actively hunted by killers. Wade stood up, pulling his heavy wolfskin coat off the peg. He walked over to Cora, holding out a spare modified Colt revolver. "I can promise to put my body between you and the lead Cora," Wade said, his voice dropping to a low, fierce rumble. "But out there the mountain makes the rules. Are you ready?" Cora took the heavy revolver, feeling the cold steel against her palm. She looked up at the giant of a man who had saved her life, realizing she didn't just trust him. She had fallen deeply, irrevocably in love with him. "Let's go take back my mountain," she said. The trek to Devil's Horn Ridge was agonizing. The snow was waist-deep in places, and the biting wind threatened to steal the air from their lungs. For 2 days they pushed through the unforgiving terrain, surviving on dried elk meat and the sheer force of their combined will. Wade led the way, using his massive frame to break the trail, constantly checking their back trail to ensure Vermilion wasn't closing in. They reached the telegraph relay station, a ramshackle, wind-battered shack clinging to the edge of a sheer drop, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon on the second day. Levi, the grizzled telegraph operator, nearly shot them before recognizing Wade's voice. Within an hour, the urgent coded Morse signals were bouncing down the copper wire toward Cheyenne, aimed directly at U.S. Marshal Heck Thomas. "Thomas wired back," Levi said, tearing the ticker tape from the brass machine. "He's bringing 5 federal deputies on a specialized snow-clearing locomotive. They'll be at the Deadwoods Reach depot by tomorrow noon. Then we need to be at the Silver Queen mine by noon," Wade said, turning to Cora. "That's where Amos will be meeting the Anaconda Company executives. We corner him there on your property, with the marshal waiting in the wings." The descent the next morning was perilous, but the anticipation of justice fueled their steps. However, the wilderness is a cruel mistress, and luck in the Dakota Territory is notoriously fickle. As they navigated the narrow, icy switchbacks leading down to the entrance of the abandoned Silver Queen mine, a rifle shot shattered the morning silence. A bullet struck the granite boulder, mere inches from Cora's head, showering her in sharp rock fragments. Wade tackled her into the deep snow, pulling her behind the massive boulder, just as a volley of gunfire erupted from the tree line below. "They found our tracks," Wade shouted over the deafening crack of Winchester rifles. He peered around the rock edge, his eyes narrowing. "It's Vermilion, and he's got Sheriff Miller and 3 deputies with him." "Amos?" Cora asked, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Down by the mine entrance. I see his carriage." Wade confirmed. They were pinned down, outnumbered and outgunned, but Wade Callahan had not survived the bloody plains of the Indian Territory by playing defensively. "Stay here," Wade commanded, his eyes burning with a terrifying protective fire. He pulled 3 sticks of mining dynamite from his pack supplies he had bartered from Levi at the relay station. He quickly tied them together with a short fuse. "When I move, you cover the left flank. Do not hesitate." Before Cora could argue, Wade lunged out from behind the boulder, charging down the steep incline with the speed and ferocity of a wild grizzly. Sheriff Miller's men panicked at the sight of the giant mountain man barreling toward them. They broke cover, their shots flying wildly into the snow. Wade struck a match against his belt buckle, lit the fuse, and hurled the bundle of dynamite toward the heavy snowpack resting on the cliffs directly above Vermilion's position. The explosion was catastrophic. The concussion knocked Cora off her feet, and a massive wall of white instantly collapsed. A localized avalanche roared down the slope, burying 2 of Miller's deputies and forcing Texas Jack Vermilion to scramble frantically out of the gorge, abandoning his contract to save his own skin. Sheriff Horace Miller, however, had managed to dodge the snowfall. He emerged from the dusting powder, raising his Colt directly at Wade's exposed back as the mountain man regained his footing. Bang! The shot didn't come from Miller. The corrupt sheriff dropped his weapon, clutching a shattered shoulder, and collapsed screaming into the snow. Wade spun around. 50 yards up the ridge, Cora stood trembling, but resolute smoke drifting lazily from the barrel of the Colt revolver he had given her. She had not hesitated. The gunfire abruptly ceased, leaving a ringing silence in the freezing air. Down below at the entrance to the Silver Queen mine, Amos Pendleton was frantically trying to whip his carriage horses into a frenzy, desperate to escape the carnage. But the path was blocked. The shrill, piercing whistle of a steam locomotive echoed up from the valley floor. Riding up the canyon path clad in heavy winter dusters and bearing the unmistakable authority of the United States government was Marshal Heck Thomas and a posse of federal deputies. Wade and Cora descended the rest of the slope side by side. When they reached the carriage, Amos was surrounded by federal shotguns. The cowardly brother looked at Cora, his face pale as a ghost, staring at the sister he had condemned to a freezing death. "You're dead," Amos stammered, shaking uncontrollably. "I saw you freeze. I saw it." Cora walked up to the carriage, pulling the brass pocket watch from her coat. She opened it, extracting the federal deed, and held it up for Marshal Thomas to see. "I am Cora Pendleton," she said, her voice ringing clear and steady across the snowy canyon, "sole heir to the Silver Queen mine. And this man is trespassing on my property." Marshal Thomas tipped his hat to her, a grim smile crossing his weathered face. He looked past her to the towering figure of Wade Callahan. "It's been a long time, Wade. I see you finally found a reason to come down from the clouds." Wade looked down at Cora, stepping close enough to wrap his massive arm around her waist, pulling her securely against his side. "I found the only reason that matters, Heck. Amos Pendleton and Sheriff Miller were hauled away in irons, destined for a federal penitentiary where neither bribes nor forged papers could save them. The Anaconda Company executives, horrified by the federal sting, legally purchased the mining rights directly from Cora for a staggering, life-altering sum. Cora did not return to the stifling parlor of her old homestead in Deadwood's Reach. Instead, she used her newfound fortune to build a sprawling, magnificent timber ranch at the very edge of the timberline, right where the valley met the mountains. It was a home built with massive hearths and thick glass windows that looked out over the Dakota wilderness, and there, the heiress of the Silver Queen and the ghost of the mountain lived out their days, proving that while the winter can freeze the ground, it can never extinguish a fire that is meant to burn. If this tale of frontier justice and romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. We bring you the most thrilling stories of the Wild West every single week. Do not let algorithms bury these legends. Share this video with friends and subscribe to our channel for more epic adventures. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought of Wade and Cora. Stay wild, and we will see you in the next great video.